From above, Egypt does not look like a country. It looks like a miracle stitched to a river. A thin green vein runs through an ocean of sand, and nearly everything alive clings to that narrow strip, as if the desert is pressing in from all sides. Beyond the Nile, the map turns quiet plateaus, salt depressions, and stone fields where footsteps vanish within minutes. And yet, this is where empires learn to count time-measure stars and carve eternity into rock. What kind of land forces civilization into a single lifeline? And what happens when that lifeline is stretched to its limit? Egypt's first secret is that it was never built on land in the usual sense. It was built on a corridor, on a ribbon of alluvium, laid down grain by grain, flood by flood, over thousands of years. The Nile did not simply pass through this country, it engineered it. On either side, the desert stands like a wall. In between, the river writes a thin, fertile exception. Long before the world learned the word, Sahara North Africa was not always an endless sand sea. Over deep time, climate swung like a slow pendulum. Wet phases turned portions of today's desert into grassland and lakes. Dry phases returned, hardening the ground, emptying basins, and leaving behind stone and dust as memory. Egypt's landscape carries those shifts like scars, fossil valleys, ancient shorelines, and dry channels that hint at water where none exists now. The Nile itself is a story of distance and patience. It gathers from faraway highlands and equatorial rains, then funnels all that movement into a single artery that cuts through aridity. Near the river, the air feels different. The soil darkens. The ground softens. Then just a few steps away, the world becomes brittle again. Pale rock grit and heat shimmering like a warning. Egypt's deserts are not one desert. They are multiple worlds stitched together. To the west lies the Western Desert, vast, deceptively smooth, from far away, but full of hidden geometry. There are dune seas that travel like slow storms. There are depressions that sink below sea level, such as the Qattara Depression, where the land drops into a broad, harsh lowland, and salt gathers like a crust. And there are white chalk formations in places like the White Desert, where wind has carved soft limestone into shapes that look unreal. Mushrooms, towers, drifting silhouettes, stone, pretending to be something alive. To the east, the Eastern Desert rises in a different language. Here the ground tightens into mountains and hard rock ridges, and wadis copper-colored slopes that catch the sun and throw it back. These are older bones, ancient crystalline rocks, and metamorphic belts, the kind of terrain that does not crumble into gentle dunes, but breaks into sharp lines. Water rarely appears yet. When it does through a sudden flash flood, it behaves like an intruder, tearing through dry channels with shocking force before vanishing again. Between these two deserts, the Nile Valley runs like a narrow tunnel of life. Northward, that tunnel widens into the Nile Delta, a fan-shaped spread of sediment where the river slows branches and finally surrenders to the Mediterranean. This is not a static landform. The delta is a living negotiation between river and sea, the Nile depositing silt, the Mediterranean pushing back with waves, currents, and salt. Every century adjusts the border. Every decade redraws small coastlines. The solid ground here is always in motion, just too slow for the eye to catch. And then there is Sinai, the hinge of continents. Sinai feels like a bridge, but geologically it is closer to a seam under tension. Egypt sits near one of Earth's great tectonic dramas, the rifting of the Red Sea region. The Red Sea is not merely a body of water. It is part of a spreading system, a place where the crust has been pulled apart over geological time, creating a long, narrow basin and uplifting rugged margins. The gulfs that flank Sinai, Suez, and Aqaba echo that same tectonic story in different forms. One, a broad opening; the other, a sharper, deeper fracture zone. The result is a landscape that can feel strangely unfinished, as if the planet is still deciding what shape this corner of the world should take. Climate finishes the sculpting. Egypt is dominated by aridity, intense sun, scarce rain, wide temperature, swings between day and night. In spring, hot dust-laden winds can sweep in, turning the air opaque and the horizon into a blur. Along the Mediterranean coast, the atmosphere softens, slightly cooler sea air, more humidity, a different kind of light. Along the Red Sea mountains, meet water in a narrow strip, and the heat can feel concentrated, pressed between rock and salt. Yet the most profound geological truth remains simple. Egypt is a country of edges, the edge between river and desert, the edge between delta and sea, the edge between continents that drift and pull. Civilization did not bloom here because the land was generous. It bloomed because the land was strict, because water arrived like a command, and survival demanded precision. If the ground beneath Egypt was shaped by climate swings, shifting seas, and tectonic tension, if even the delta is still negotiating with the ocean, then what in this landscape can ever truly be called permanent? In Egypt, life is not spread evenly. It is concentrated, staged, and fiercely selective. The country's biodiversity is not defined by endless forests or gentle rainfall. It is defined by boundaries between wet and dry salt, and fresh rock and sand mountain shade, and open sun. In a place where water is a rare verdict, every living thing becomes a specialist. The Nile is the obvious heart of this system, but its influence is more than visual. Along its banks, the air carries moisture. The soil holds together. Plants can afford to be generous. Reeds, grasses, crops, and trees that would never survive a few kilometers into open desert. In the morning, the river edge comes alive with small movements, insects hovering above water birds calling from palm fronds, fish breaking the surface in quick silver flashes. Even the sound changes here. The desert has a silence that presses down. The river has a silence that breathes. Further north, the Nile Delta spreads out like a hand opening, branches dividing channels, slowing water, negotiating with land. Here the ecosystem becomes softer and more complicated. Wetlands form wherever water lingers, marshy pockets, reed beds, and brackish lagoons that blur the line between river and sea. These areas can look calm, but they are busy with hidden traffic. They are feeding grounds, nurseries, resting stations. For migratory birds, Egypt is not just a destination. It is a bridge between continents. Twice a year, the skies can carry an invisible map. Birds moving between Europe, Asia, and Africa follow coastlines, river corridors, and wetlands like glowing threads only they can see. Some skim low over water. Others spiral high on thermals, watching for the next safe place to land. In the delta and along coastal lagoons, their presence can turn a quiet horizon into a moving tapestry. Waders, stepping delicately through shallows, flocks lifting as one body wings, catching light like quick mirrors. The journey is ancient. The timing is precise. And it raises a question that lingers in the air. If these routes have guided life for thousands of years, what happens when the rest stops begin to disappear? Southward, the river changes character again. It becomes narrower, more contained, sometimes calmer, sometimes restless. In stretches where the current slows, aquatic plants can thicken along the edges. In warmer months, the surface can look deceptively still, as if the water is holding its breath. But beneath it, life continues in layers. Fish adapted to turbid conditions navigate by vibration and shadow. Amphibians and insects build their entire existence around the thin margin where water touches mud. And then there are the larger presences creatures that feel like echoes from another age. In southern reaches and in large reservoirs, crocodiles can still exist as living reminders that Egypt's ecology once extended far beyond the narrow strips seen today. They are not symbols in stone here. They are real animals in real water, shaped by heat and patience. When one surfaces, it does not splash. It simply arrives, like a thought that refuses to leave. But Egypt's biodiversity is not only the story of the Nile. Away from the river, the desert appears empty until the eye learns to slow down. Desert life rarely advertises itself. It hides from the sun, waits for cooler hours, and writes its presence in tracks rather than in sound. At dawn, footprints lace the sand. Thin lines dot sudden drags evidence of nocturnal movement. A small rodent may have crossed in search of seeds. A fox may have followed. A snake may have slipped between stones without leaving a clear signature at all. In the Western Desert, survival is an art of minimalism. Many animals live as if they are made of shadow desert foxes that hunt quietly small mammals that store moisture through metabolism, reptiles that regulate heat with ruthless efficiency. Even plants here are mathematicians. Some remain dormant for years, waiting for the rare rain. Others, like acacias or hardy shrubs, cling to wadis and low pockets where groundwater sits slightly closer to the surface. Their roots reach deep, searching in darkness for a promise that the sky rarely keeps. Then come the oases, Egypt's hidden rooms. Each oasis feels like a pocket of the world that has been spared. Date palms rise like green flames. Gardens form careful grids. Water appears in springs or wells, and around it a miniature ecosystem unfolds. Birds gather. Insects return. Human life settles into patterns shaped by irrigation shade and seasonal rhythms. Yet even these refugees are fragile. Their water sources are not infinite. Their green borders are not secure. They exist because geology allows it, because underground aquifers, ancient rainfall, and layers of rock have stored water like a secret for millennia. In places like Siwa and other desert oases, that secret is shared by everything that lives there. It is also negotiated daily how much water can be used, how much must be saved, what happens when tourism arrives, what happens when wells deepen and the balance shifts. To the east, the story changes again. The eastern desert is harsher in shape, with mountains and dry valleys that look carved rather than eroded. Life here tends to be scattered and stubborn. After rare rainfall, wadis can briefly green with unexpected plants, as if the land is remembering an older version of itself. In the mountains of Sinai, altitude brings cooler nights and slightly different ecological niches, small patches where endemic plants can cling to rock cracks, where hardy shrubs survive in thin soils, where ibex and other mountain-adapted animals move with the caution of creatures that cannot waste energy. And then, on the edge of Egypt's heat, there is water that feels almost impossible, the Red Sea. It is a different universe from the river. Here, life does not depend on fresh water and silt. It depends on salt clarity and sunlight. Coral reefs rise like underwater cities, branching, layered, crowded with color. Fish move through them in quick bursts, as if the reef is a living maze. Some species vanish the moment a shadow passes overhead. Others hover in plain sight, as bold as flags. The reef system is not simply beautiful. It is engineered. Coral polyps build limestone skeletons over time, creating structure that shelters countless organisms, fish crustaceans, mollusks, and algae, each with its own role in the reef's fragile economy. Nearby seagrass meadows can act like underwater fields, supporting species that need calm feeding grounds. In some parts of the Red Sea coastline, mangroves appear tough trees that tolerate salt-anchoring shorelines and offering nurseries for young fish. These coastal ecosystems are quiet powerhouses. They stabilize, they feed, they protect. Yet the Red Sea also carries a warning because its clarity makes damage visible. A broken coral branch is not hidden by murky water. A scar on the reef does not fade quickly. The question is not whether this ecosystem is valuable. The question is whether it can remain intact while the human appetite for coastlines continues to grow. Egypt's biodiversity, in the end, is a story of corridors and islands. The Nile is the corridor. The delta wetlands are the threshold. The deserts are the test. The oases are islands of relief. The mountains are pockets of resistance. The Red Sea is a parallel world, abundant, intricate, and sensitive. And through all of it, one rule repeats: life here survives by precision. It adapts to extremes. It finds shade. It drinks at night. It migrates when it must. It evolves into specialists rather than generalists. But what does that mean for the people who live inside this ecological geometry? If nature in Egypt is concentrated into thin lifelines and fragile pockets, how did human life begin here? And what kind of culture grows from a landscape that never stops demanding respect? Egypt's earliest human story does not begin with pyramids. It begins with movement, small groups reading the landscape the way sailors read a sea. Before the Nile became a corridor of farms and temples, it was a promise cutting through uncertainty. It offered waterfish, reeds, birds, and a predictable rhythm in a continent where rhythm could vanish. For thousands of years, the wider Sahara was not always the absolute void it appears to be now. Evidence across the desert suggests there were greener phases, times when rainfall returned, when lakes formed, when grasslands spread, and people lived far from the modern riverbanks. Rock art in remote desert regions hints at animals and scenes that feel impossible in today's Egypt, creatures that require water herds, that imply pasture human gatherings, that suggest a landscape capable of sustaining more than silence. Then the pendulum swung again. The wet world retreated. The desert hardened. And people like water began to funnel toward the Nile. That slow migration mattered more than any single event. Because when a harsh environment narrows the options, it forces invention. The river's edge became more than a place to stop it, became a place to stay. Over time, temporary camps became seasonal settlements. Seasonal settlements became permanent villages. And permanent villages began to depend on the river, not as a convenience, but as a clock. The Nile's flood cycle shaped early Egyptian life with a kind of stern generosity. Each year, the river rose and spread, laying down fine silt like dark flour over the fields. When it receded, it left behind soil that could feed people again. In many parts of the ancient world, survival was a gamble against rain. Here, survival could become a schedule if the community learned to read the water and coordinate its labor. That coordination is where culture begins to form. Not as art first, but as cooperation. Dikes, canals, and irrigation channels required shared planning and shared maintenance. Granaries required shared rules. If one household stored too much, while another starved, the village fractured. If floods came early or late, the village had to adapt together or collapse separately. From that pressure, early social structures grew. Leaders emerged not necessarily because they were powerful, but because someone needed to organize the work, settle disputes, and manage storage. Over generations, those roles could harden into hierarchies. Land became counted. Labor became assigned. The river, which had been a natural miracle, became an administrative challenge. This is where Egypt's famous sense of order begins to appear not as a philosophical idea, but as a survival tactic. The landscape demanded balance. Too little flood meant hunger. Too much flood meant destruction. Life depended on getting the measure right. Out of that daily negotiation, the early Egyptian worldview took shape: a reverence for stability, an obsession with cycles, and a deep belief that chaos was not an abstract fear. It was a real threat that could sweep through fields and homes. But the Nile did something else too. It created a long, narrow meeting place. Villages lined the banks like beads on a thread. People traveled by water more easily than by land, moving good stories and customs up and down the valley. Over time, regional identities formed communities with their own styles of pottery, burial practices, and symbols. Archaeologists often speak of pre-dynastic cultures not as one uniform civilization, but as a mosaic slowly moving toward unity. In the south, nearer to the river's narrower stretches, communities developed with close ties to trade routes that ran deeper into Africa. In the north, closer to the delta's branching waterways, communities lived in a world of marshes, fish, and shifting channels that touched the Mediterranean. The geography itself encouraged difference. Upper Egypt's valley felt contained and linear. Lower Egypt's delta felt open, sprawling, and complex. And yet, the river connected them like an argument that could not be avoided forever. Burial practices offer quiet clues to what these early communities believed. Even before the rise of dynasties, the dead were treated with care, placed in graves with objects, tools, ornaments, sometimes food. That habit suggests a mind already thinking beyond one lifetime. It suggests an early sense of continuity, that life was not simply a line that ended, but a cycle that shifted forms. In a landscape where the river died into dry ground and returned again, it is not hard to imagine why the human imagination would start to frame existence the same way. Over time, symbols became systems. Simple marks evolved into more formal imagery. What began as decoration or identity may have become communication, an increasingly shared visual language that could label goods, record ownership, mark sacred space, and honor rulers. The birth of writing in Egypt was not a sudden magic trick. It was a response to complexity. A society managing harvest labor and trade eventually needs memory stronger than spoken words. And then the central drama emerges, the consolidation of power along the Nile. Villages became towns. Towns competed. Regional chiefs gained influence. In a corridor where resources were concentrated and travel was possible, rivalry was inevitable. So was unification. Egypt's earliest state formation appears to have been a long process of merging, absorbing, and organizing until the Nile Valley could be imagined as one body rather than many fragments. In that moment, Egypt becomes something rare, a civilization shaped not by scattered fertile land, but by a single spine. The river made unity possible. The desert made it necessary. Because when arable land is limited control over that land becomes the central tension. The environment turns politics into geography. Religion, too, can be read as a reflection of this environment. Early Egyptian belief systems did not emerge in isolation from the landscape. They grew from it. The sun's daily journey over the desert horizon, the river's annual rising and falling, the steady turning of seasons, these cycles were not background. They were everything. Deities tied to fertility, to the sky, to the underworld, to the river's life-giving force. These were not myths in the modern sense. They were explanations, comforts, and moral frameworks for a life lived at the edge of instability. Even the idea of sacred kingship can be seen as an answer to a practical problem: how to keep order in a society that depends on coordinated water management, labor organization, and food storage. A ruler was not simply a political figure. A ruler became a symbol that the world could remain balanced. The state, in turn, became a machine designed to keep that balance from breaking. Yet, it would be a mistake to imagine early Egyptians as only farmers and administrators. They were also artists of the everyday. They understood how to build with mud brick, how to weave reeds, how to craft boats from papyrus and wood, how to shape stone tools into reliable forms. Their markets exchanged more than goods. Ideas traveled too. Copperstone pigments, shells, and rare materials moved along routes that linked the Nile to deserts, coasts, and distant regions. Even in early periods, Egypt was not isolated. It was connected by water, by trade, by curiosity. And all the while, the desert remained present. It was not merely outside. It was a bordering force that shaped identity. The desert was danger, yes, but also a source of minerals, roots, and spiritual imagination. It was a place of testing and transformation. In later eras, deserts would become landscapes of pilgrimage, retreat, and mythic journeys. But even early on, they carried meaning, the line where cultivated life ended and raw existence began. The greatest paradox of early Egypt is that it is both fragile and enduring. Fragile because it depends on a narrow ecological corridor. Enduring because once that corridor is mastered, Once the rhythm of flood planting and harvest is understood, culture can accumulate, knowledge can stack, architecture can rise, memory can be carved. This accumulation is what creates the feeling that Egypt appears fully formed in history. But behind that illusion are centuries of slow adaptation, learning how to coordinate irrigation, how to store grain, how to settle disputes, how to turn scattered villages into a shared identity, and how to place human life into a cosmic story that makes suffering and death bearable. So when the later monuments appear, stone temples, carved texts, colossal statues, they should not be seen as the beginning. They are the consequence. They are what happens when a society has survived long enough to think beyond survival. They are what happens when a people shaped by a strict landscape begins to believe it can outlast time itself. And still one question remains at the edge of this origin story. If Egypt's early culture was born from a river's mercy and a desert's pressure, what happens when outsiders arrive, when exploration, conquest, trade, and resource hunger turn this narrow lifeline into a prize? Egypt's history is often told through stone pyramids, temples, carved faces staring past centuries. But the deeper story is written in motion. Boats sliding along the Nile caravans, cutting across sand-foreign sails, appearing on the Mediterranean horizon, and armies following the same narrow green corridor because there is simply nowhere else to go. The Nile made Egypt legible. It offered a natural route that could move people and power in both directions, tying Upper and Lower Egypt into a single elongated world. That same route also made Egypt vulnerable. If the country is a lifeline, then whoever controls the lifeline controls the body. And once Egypt became known as a place where grain could grow reliably, where trade could pass between seas, it was never going to be left alone. Long before modern borders, Egypt's geography placed it in a permanent negotiation with its neighbors. To the east lay the Sinai Passage, narrow, harsh, strategic, linking the Nile world to the Levant and beyond. To the west stretched the deserts with their oases and caravan routes, connecting Egypt to North Africa's interior. To the north opened the Mediterranean, a highway of empires. To the south, the Nile pointed toward deep Africa, not as a barrier, but as a corridor of exchange. Trade was not an accessory to Egyptian history. It was a pulse. Precious materials did not grow out of Nile mud, copper, gold, incense, timber stone. Of rare quality, these came from somewhere else. So routes formed. Barges carried goods up and down the river. Desert paths stitched oases into a network of survival. Coastal ports became doors through which the world entered. Then came the shifts that turn a region into a prize. Egypt's story contains repeated waves of conquest and cultural layering, not because Egypt lacked identity, but because its location made it irresistible. When foreign powers arrived, they did not erase Egypt so much as attach themselves to it, trying to harness what the Nile already provided: food labor, strategic access, symbolic prestige. Alexandria is one of the clearest examples of this transformation. Rising on the Mediterranean edge, it became a city where the sea met the river's influence, a place built for connection, for knowledge, for commerce. It represented a different kind of Egyptian power, not only agricultural stability, but intellectual and maritime gravity. The story of Alexandria signals a pattern that repeats across centuries Egypt as both a homeland and a crossroads. Under Roman rule, Egypt's agricultural output, especially grain, became a strategic pillar for feeding populations across the Mediterranean world. This was not an abstract economic fact. It was a political reality that shaped control, taxation, and infrastructure. Fields along the river were no longer just local survival. They were part of an imperial supply chain. If harvests failed, distant cities felt it. If governance tightened, villages along the Nile felt it first. But Egypt was never simply used. It responded, adapted, and reshaped itself. New languages arrived, new faiths, new administrative systems. The rise of Cairo in the medieval era, growing into a major urban center, illustrates how Egypt's heart could shift while the underlying geography stayed constant. Cities rose where the corridor allowed them to rise near the river, near crossroads, near points where trade and governance could concentrate. And always the desert remained as both shield and threat. Armies marched where water could sustain them. Control was easiest where the land could feed people. That meant the river corridor became not only a lifeline, but also a battlefield of logistics. The desert did not need to defeat invaders. It only needed to wait for them to miscalculate. In the early modern period, Egypt continued to sit under larger imperial umbrellas, but the 19th century brought a new kind of ambition, one tied to modernization, industry, and global trade. This era is marked by the sharpening sense that Egypt's location was not just regional power, but global leverage. The Mediterranean and the Red Sea were no longer separate worlds in the minds of engineers and empires. They were endpoints that could be stitched together. The Suez Canal becomes the most dramatic symbol of that idea. Carved through desert, it turned geography into infrastructure. It shortened sea routes and reweighted world trade. And it also transformed Egypt into a place where global powers watched every decision with heightened intensity. The canal is not merely a waterway. It is a nerve, and nerves attract pressure. The canal's story also holds a human undertone, often lost behind maps. It represents labor displacement and the collision between grand engineering and everyday life. It represents the desert being forced to accept a cut that would never naturally exist. And it raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. When the land is reshaped for global movement, who gains the most and who pays the quiet cost? Exploration in Egypt's modern story is not only about geography. It is also about excavation, about the world's hunger to uncover, interpret, and sometimes possess Egypt's past. The late 18th and 19th centuries saw European fascination accelerate into organized expeditions, scholarship, and archaeology. Egypt became, in the Western imagination, a kind of museum under open sky. Temples were measured, tombs were entered, artifacts were documented, removed, displayed. This period is filled with contradictions. On one hand, it produced knowledge, scripts, deciphered timelines, clarified histories connected. On the other, it carried exploitation, a race for objects, prestige, and ownership often detached from the living communities that existed beside these ancient sites. Luxor and the Theban region illustrate this tension vividly. Here, the landscape feels like a library, carved in stone valleys, hiding tombs, columns rising from sand inscriptions, catching the sun at angles that make them look freshly cut. Yet just beyond the monumental zones, everyday life continues. Markets, farms, families, routines shaped by the same river that once fed pharaohs. The past and present do not sit in separate rooms. They overlap in the same air. Meanwhile, Egypt's own internal transformations continued. The 20th century brought nationalism changing political structures and a modern state grappling with population growth and the demands of development. In this era, another monumental intervention redefined the country's relationship with the Nile, the Aswan High Dam. The dam is a perfect example of Egypt's central theme control versus consequence. It offered flood regulation, hydroelectric power, and more predictable irrigation. It also altered the river's ecology, sediment flow, and the ancient rhythm that had shaped life for millennia. A natural cycle was replaced with an engineered schedule. The Nile became more manageable, but also more artificial. This shift is not just technical, it is emotional. It means a society that once watched the flood with reverence and fear now lives under a different kind of uncertainty, dependence on infrastructure, vulnerability to upstream politics, and long-term environmental changes that don't announce themselves immediately. And Egypt's deserts, so often treated as empty, continued to produce their own historical threads. The Western desert's oases became strategic outposts and cultural islands. The Sinai became not just a bridge, but a contested zone carrying military and political weight far beyond its sparse population. The Red Sea coast grew into a space of modern tourism trade and ecological tension. Egypt's map began to stretch its focus beyond the Nile corridor, even as the corridor remained the demographic and agricultural heart. A representative way to see Egypt's historical development is to follow three spines at once. First, the river spine, where cities like Cairo Luxor and Aswan anchor population and memory. Here, history feels dense layers stacked so tightly that one era bleeds into the next. Second, the sea spine, where Alexandria and the Canal Zone connect Egypt to global trade and strategic power. Here, history feels outward-facing, defined by ships' routes, diplomacy, and the world's attention. Third, the desert spine, where oases, mountain passes, and remote coastlines remind everyone that Egypt is larger than its green strip. Here, history feels like endurance, fewer people, bigger distances, and a constant dialogue with scarcity. These spines do not run separately, they intersect. A decision made for the canal affects the economy of the river valley. A dam built in the south changes life in the delta. A conflict in Sinai echoes across ports and cities. Egypt's development is not a straight line. It is a web pulled tight by geography. And through every era, one motif returns Egypt's struggle to keep balance inside a landscape that demands precision. Too much dependence on outsiders and the country becomes a corridor for someone else's ambition. Too much isolation, and it risks falling behind global currents. Too much control over nature and ecosystems fray. Too little control, and the river's unpredictability can punish. So the question becomes sharper as the story approaches the present. If Egypt's past was shaped by a river that gives life, deserts that demand discipline, and a canal that exposes the country to global pressure, what does modern Egypt look like under the added weight of climate change, rising seas and the delta water politics, and the relentless pull of tourism and urban growth? Modern Egypt still lives inside the same ancient geometry, a narrow lifeline of fresh water, surrounded by aridity, with most people clustered where the land can feed them. But the pressures now arrive from multiple directions at once: climate, population, infrastructure, tourism, and the global economy, each one pulling on the same limited space. The Nile Delta is where those pressures feel most exposed. This low, fertile fan of land is often described as one of Egypt's great breadbaskets, yet it sits at the edge of a changing sea. Coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion, and gradual land subsidence can combine into a slow crisis that rarely looks dramatic on any single day, but accumulates year by year. Farmland can become less productive as salinity creeps into soils. Freshwater channels can feel more contested in dry seasons. Communities that have lived for generations on the delta's edges can begin to face an unsettling question: if the coastline keeps shifting, where does home go? This modern anxiety is not only environmental, it is also demographic. Egypt's population growth and urban expansion have intensified the competition for arable land along the Nile corridor. Cities spread outward, sometimes consuming farmland that once served as a buffer between the river and the desert. New roads, new housing, and new industry offer opportunity, but they also place more demand on water energy and food systems already stretched thin. Water management therefore becomes not just an engineering matter, but a cultural one. The Aswan High Dam and the reservoirs it created helped regulate floods and stabilize irrigation, making agriculture more predictable in many areas. Yet the river's ancient rhythm was altered, and downstream environments adjusted accordingly. Sediment that once replenished fields and shores became trapped upstream. Fisheries and soil patterns shifted. It is a familiar modern trade control brings stability, but it can also quietly change what the land has relied on for centuries. And beyond Egypt's borders, the Nile is part of a larger story. Upstream development and shifting rainfall patterns can make the river feel less like a guaranteed inheritance and more like a shared system requiring diplomacy and careful planning. Even when agreements exist, the emotional truth remains: a society built on one lifeline tends to feel vulnerable when that lifeline depends on forces beyond its direct control. Alongside water and land tourism has become one of Egypt's most visible modern dilemmas because it brings economic lifeblood while also risking cultural and ecological strain. Egypt's ancient sites are not sealed behind glass. They are exposed to sun dust vibration and the footsteps of millions. In places like Giza Luxor and the Valley of the Kings, preservation often requires constant intervention, controlled access restoration programs, regulation of nearby development. The visitor experience can feel like a celebration of heritage, yet it can also become a pressure test. When too many people arrive at once, what happens to a place that was never built for modern crowds? What happens when the world's wonder becomes a daily commute for locals living beside it? At the same time, tourism has expanded beyond temples into coastlines, especially along the Red Sea. Resorts in areas such as Hurghada and Sharm el-Sheikh have helped create jobs infrastructure and a global image of Egypt that is not only ancient, but also recreational and modern. Yet the Red Sea's reefs, seagrass meadows, and coastal habitats are sensitive. Boats' anchors, coastal construction pollution, and careless snorkeling can damage ecosystems that take decades to recover. Some reef sections appear resilient, others show clear signs of stress, and the difference often comes down to management and behavior. Where mooring systems exist, where marine protected areas are enforced, where visitor education is taken seriously. This is where modern Egypt reveals a powerful contradiction. The same nature that attracts people is the nature that can be harmed by their arrival. Coral reefs are not simply scenery. They are living structures. When they break, they do not simply grow back on a human schedule. The question becomes uncomfortable, but necessary. Can a coastline remain a paradise if its success depends on the slow exhaustion of what makes it beautiful? Culture in modern Egypt lives in this tension between continuity and acceleration. Cairo is a vivid example, a city where time stacks rather than replaces itself. Minarets and high-rises share the same skyline. Ancient street patterns coexist with modern traffic, and daily life moves through layers of history without always naming them. The call to prayer, the marketplace, rhythms, the evening gatherings, the cafes. These are not tourist performances. They are living habits. Yet Cairo also holds the friction of modernity congestion, air quality challenges, economic inequality, and the relentless speed of change. Beyond Cairo, Egypt's cultural life remains deeply regional. In the Delta, communities can be shaped by agriculture, fishing, and family networks tied to land. In Upper Egypt, traditions may feel more locally rooted with strong communal identity and social patterns that reflect the valley's narrower geography. In Sinai Bedouin, heritage and knowledge of desert routes persists even as modern borders, security concerns, and tourism reshape the region's economy and movement. In the oases, cultural identity can feel almost island-like, defined by water rights, date harvests, and the careful choreography of survival. Climate change adds another layer of uncertainty to all of this. Heat waves can intensify, water demand can rise, coastal areas can face growing risk, desert environments can become more punishing. The challenge is not only physical, it is psychological. A landscape that already demands respect can begin to feel less predictable. And predictability is what civilizations crave when they build along a river. Yet modern Egypt is also a story of resilience and reinvention. It is a country that has adapted across millennia through shifts in empire, economy, and environment, while holding on to the same core truth: life here depends on balance. The balance between river and desert, between heritage and development, between welcoming the world and protecting what the world comes to see. So the question that hangs over the present is not whether Egypt will endure, it has endured. The question is, what kind of endurance will be required next? If the delta continues to negotiate with the sea, if the river becomes more contested, if tourism keeps expanding, and if cities keep growing, what does sustainability mean in a land where the margin for error has always been thin? Egypt is often imagined as eternal stone monuments standing in the sun, names carved deep enough to outlast empires. But the real eternity here is not the architecture. It is the balance. A balance so thin, it can be traced on a satellite image, one green corridor, one branching delta, and an ocean of desert pressing close on both sides. Everything in this journey has returned to the same truth Egypt survives by precision. The Nile gathers distant rains and delivers them like a verdict. The deserts demand discipline and punish waste. The Red Sea offers a parallel world of color and abundance, yet reveals every scar when that abundance is taken for granted. Even the ground tells a story of motion of coasts that shift, basins that sink, and landscapes still shaped by forces older than memory. And that is what makes Egypt feel like the edge of the world, not because it is remote, but because it exposes the edge between thriving and collapsing. Here, civilization did not bloom in comfort. It bloomed under pressure. It learned to turn cycles into stability, scarcity into organization, and geography into identity. But the modern era has tightened the margins. A delta negotiating with a rising sea. A river system facing growing demand. Cities expanding into the same limited strip that feeds them. Tourism bringing income and connection while asking fragile sites and ecosystems to absorb millions of footsteps, boat wakes, and photographs. So what does it mean to love a place like this? Truly love it beyond the postcard. It means seeing Egypt not as a museum, but as a living system. It means understanding that every temple stands in a landscape that still breathes, and every reef is a living architecture with its own limits. It means traveling with restraint, respecting protected zones, supporting local guides, and community-based tourism, choosing operators who follow environmental rules, and learning enough about the land to recognize when beauty is becoming stress. And it means carrying the story forward. Because awareness is not passive. If a landscape is fragile, then attention becomes a form of protection. In the end, the edge of the world is not a line on a map. It is the moment a place forces a question into the viewer's mind and refuses to let it go. If a civilization could rise from a thin ribbon of water and hold on for millennia, what excuses does the modern world have for forgetting how to live within limits